It's a busy weather week. There is a lot going on. Hello, welcome, and thank you for joining me for this week's deep dive. I'm Alex Burkill, meteorologist and presenter here at the Met Office. I will be talking about what the weather's going to be doing through this week and beyond. I'm actually going to be joined by a special guest later on, looking at what we can expect through the rest of this winter, and I'll be having a little look back at what we saw through November and through the whole of autumn. But like I said, there is a lot happening this week, so let's get going. We have at the moment quite well, we're kind of in the respite period of some sort, but I wanted to show you the jet stream as we go through this week. Now, as you will no doubt be aware, the jet stream plays a really active part in what the weather across the UK is doing, and I wanted to highlight that it's going to strengthen quite rapidly as we go through the next 48 hours or so. In fact, as we go towards tomorrow evening overnight, a really strong jet is coming towards the UK. If I just try and show you this, now I have been away for a little while and I haven't done a deep dive for a little while, and since I've come back, they've played around with the buttons, but I think if I press here, that's going to give us the speed of the jet. This is coming up with 200 miles per hour. That's the speed of the winds higher up. So not the speed of the winds near the surface, but nonetheless, 200 miles per hour is really quite strong, and it could be even stronger than that. I think as we go through tomorrow night, it could be close to 250 miles per hour. That means we are going to see some pretty unsettled weather coming through. I'll talk more about that in a second. It's also good news if you're planning to travel across the Atlantic, or flying across the Atlantic, at least from west to east. If you're going the other way, less good news. But yes, planes can use the jet stream to travel even faster, so it will speed up the journey time. But back to the UK weather, and let's show you the picture that we have across the UK at the moment, because there are a couple of things that I want to highlight. So if I just run this through, and as we go through the rest of Tuesday, we have this band of rain. I'm not really sure why this isn't playing. Here we go. We have a band of rain that's pushing its way across parts of Scotland and Northern Ireland. Now, across much of the UK, it's been a fairly decent day, but this band of rain and snow, I'll pause it here, is coming through, and it could bring some fairly significant accumulations, several centimetres, mainly over higher ground, perhaps to about 100 metres or so up, so not especially high. We may see a few centimetres accumulating. Over higher ground than that, it could be a little bit more. Relatively business as usual for the time of year. We often see snow across parts of Scotland. There may be a little bit of snow perhaps over some higher ground a bit further south, maybe parts of Northern Ireland, Northern England maybe, but really the snow's largely going to be confined to northern, or to parts of Scotland, and mainly the higher ground. Perhaps the greater cause for concern as we run through the rest of the night, and that clears away. I've gone too far, apologies. We then get some clearer skies coming through, and there'll be some wintry showers as well, but because of the wet weather that's pushed through, we are at risk of seeing some icy stretches. As a result, we do have a warning in force at the moment. If I just run through, just to make you aware, there is an ice warning across much of the central eastern parts of Scotland, and that's because there could be some difficult surfaces first thing tomorrow morning, because of not only the band of rain that's come through and the snow and then the drop in temperatures with some clearer air, but also because of those wintry showers that could be making their way through as well. But back to the UK's forecast, and as we go through, let's dart ahead to Wednesday. And actually, if we start Wednesday, let's go to slightly earlier in the day. For many, Wednesday's looking like a pretty decent day. On the left-hand side, you can see we do actually have a bit of a ridge of high pressure before the strengthening jet comes its way in. And so, as a result, yes, maybe a few coastal showers in some places, but most places having a pretty decent day to start on Wednesday at least. Later on, however, we are going to see the influence of that strong jet coming through. We're going to see a band of rain sweeping its way in, and we're going to see some very strong winds, particularly towards the northwest of the UK. So let's have a look at the winds that we can expect, and I hope this works. This isn't what I was planning to do, so let's get that up. This is looking different to how I practiced it, but let's hope it works. Let's pick somewhere up here. And so these are the gusts, I believe. Yes, they are. So this is for Western Scotland. And you can see as we go through Wednesday evening overnight, they are really going to strengthen. We could be looking at gusts around 65 to 75 miles per hour in the most exposed spots. So it is going to be very windy as well as wet as that system comes in from the west. As a result, another warning to show you. There are only 2 out at the moment at time of recording. And so I think once we've got through these 2, that will be it for the warnings for the time being. But if we dart ahead to Wednesday night to Thursday, then yes, we have a warning that covers the Hebrides, the Northern Isles and the far northwest of mainland Scotland as well. So it is going to be windy as well as wet as that system comes through. But let's go back to the rain, let's go back to the split screen and we go through. If we run through, if I just press play and if we go through, so a very wet and windy picture coming through as we go through later Wednesday and overnight into Thursday. And then there's actually another system that comes through Thursday. Remember that really strong jet stream that I highlighted earlier? That's going to drive another low that pushes through on Thursday, and so more wet and windy weather making its way across. It's all coming from the west, so western parts always bearing the brunt of it, but everywhere we'll see some outbreaks of rain, and everywhere it is going to be pretty blustery. Not as strong the winds as across the far west of Scotland, but you can see some very strong gusts. If we just go back, you can see strong gusts. Why is that not working? Here we go, it's catching up. You can see as we go through Wednesday night, the strongest winds are mainly, oh, I've darted ahead. I don't know what happened there. If we go through Wednesday night, you can see the strongest winds coming along as we go towards the northwest of the UK. But as we go through into Thursday, they really are a bit more widespread perhaps around mainly the western part of the country, but it will spread a bit further south as well. So really Wednesday into Thursday, and Thursday itself is looking very wet and windy at times. Not everywhere will necessarily see impacts from this, but nonetheless it is going to be a pretty blustery picture and pretty wet at times too. Friday we then see a slight respite. The jet stream is still across us, but you can see a bit of a ridge in the pressure pattern. But yeah, Friday there will be some showers around, and then our attention turns to what's going to happen on Saturday. And so to show you that, I'm going to look at the bigger picture now. And if I just run through and dart ahead to Saturday, and what we have on Saturday, oh, I've gone too far, and I'm going to get rid of the jet stream for now and put rain on instead. And we have an area of low pressure that's set to come its way across the UK. There's been a bit of uncertainty about this low. If I'd recorded this deep dive yesterday, I'd be telling an ever so slightly different story. I'll come on to that in a second. It does look like it could be very deep, but it doesn't look as deep as it did 24 hours ago. So it's likely that we're going to have a relatively deep area of low pressure coming towards the UK as we go through into, well, late Friday and into Saturday. The most recent model run from the Met Office, our global model, is the one that I have here. And you can see it takes the track of the low mainly across southern parts of the UK, and it's not as deep as it was showing that it was 24 hours ago. Remember, the deeper the low, the more unsettled the weather we're likely to see. So the stronger the winds, the heavier the rain. So whilst this would be a very wet and windy picture, it perhaps won't be as impactful as it could have been if the scenario that we were looking at previously comes off. The other thing to bear in mind is that the track has changed, and I can show you that in a couple of ways. So here is, well, I say a couple of ways, I'm only going to show it in one way, but here are the forecast 24-hour rainfall totals from various models. We've got Met Office model on the left, ECMWF European Centre in the middle, and GFS on the right. And these are the forecast 24-hour rainfall totals from midday Friday until midday Saturday. And these are based from the previous model run, so the model run starting, that was run at midday on Monday. And they show, if we look at the Met Office model first, quite a wet picture across the UK, particularly western parts, Western Wales, but many places seeing a fair amount of rain. ECMWF, pretty similar with the position of the low, some slightly higher rainfall totals across parts of northern England and the tip of Wales perhaps, but generally a similar idea. GFS, the American model, a bit further north, but not too dissimilar. But if we compare it now to the more recent run, the midnight run from this morning, and it's very, very different. Like I said, the latest global model from the Met Office wants to have the low tracking now across southern parts of the UK as opposed to across central parts of the UK. As a result, this suggests that we'd see the heaviest rainfall totals across southern parts, and this could cause some impacts. Further north, it's likely to be a bit drier. ECMWF has a similar picture, but the rainfall totals aren't as high. Meanwhile, GFS is sticking with the low going a bit further north than the other two models, and so it keeps the highest rainfall totals across parts of Northern Ireland, southern Scotland. So quite a different story. So still a lot to play for as to exactly the track that this low is going to take. The other thing that we have to bear in mind is not just the track, but how deep it's going to get. And there is some uncertainty about that as well. I think what we can be quite confident about is that there will be some unsettled weather pushing its way through as we go through this weekend. But exactly how unsettled it's going to be, particularly for the UK, that's where there's still quite a bit of uncertainty. So we need to be aware of the track that this low is going to take and just how deep it's going to be. There's the potential that it could stay just to the south of us, and really we won't see especially impactful weather. There's the potential it comes across the UK and we could see some very impactful weather. Or there's also the possibility that the low could come across us and then deepen further as it continues its way eastwards and affect other parts of Europe a bit more. Well, affect them a bit more really, and they could see the strongest winds and the heaviest rain. So still a lot to play for as to what could happen this weekend. It could be very unsettled on Saturday in particular, or it could be that the heaviest rain, the strongest winds don't really develop until the low itself has pushed away a bit further east. So definitely one to keep up to date with. What happens thereafter? And this is actually where confidence gets a little bit higher, which is a bit weird, but I'll explain that in a second. What we're likely to see is this high pressure building from the west, and so that should clear most things out towards the east, and so the unsettled weather that we see through the rest of this week and through the weekend should push away towards the east. It may take quite a while to do so, so I think really Saturday, Sunday we're going to see further outbreaks of rain mixed in, and it's worth bearing in mind whilst I mention it before I forget, on Saturday it's not just rain and wind that we need to be aware of. There could be some snow mixed in with it too. Not on the same scale as Bert, but it could be a multi-hazard event if the worst of it comes off, but that's no guarantee at the moment. However, I think we are going to see this high pressure building as we go into the beginning of next week. So if I run that through to the end, as we go through Sunday. So yes, we end up with a bit of northerly wind, so likely to see our temperatures dropping, but then this high pressure building as we go into the beginning of next week. Now I can show you that if we look at the most likely forecast from ECMWF. So this chart shows the most likely regime for next Monday, the 9th of December from ECMWF. Now I say most likely because you may be aware that ECMWF, they use an ensemble system. So they have several members which run their model, and they run the model lots of different times with slightly different conditions each time, and then that gives us some idea of probability. Now something that's interesting about next Monday's, and I don't know if you can see, but at the top it says 100% probability. That's slightly misleading. It isn't 100% probability that this will happen. What it's actually saying is 100% all of its members are suggesting that this is the most likely regime for next Monday. They could all be slightly wrong, and so there's no guarantee that this will definitely happen, but there is exceptionally high confidence that we are going to see this high pressure coming in, and that should shift all the unsettled weather away towards the east for a bit of time as we go at least into the beginning part of next week. I can show you the confidence in a slightly different way, and this is our forecast confidence index from ECMWF. If you've not seen this chart before, what it shows is how high the confidence is in the forecast compared to average when we look how far in the future. So the dashed line is the average forecast confidence for each day as we go into the future. So as you would expect, the confidence generally on average decreases looking further ahead. And whether or not it's red or green shows whether at the stage the confidence is higher or lower than average. So if it's red, the confidence is lower than average. So slightly lower than average confidence for what the weather's going to do as we go towards the end of the week. And that kind of goes in line with the uncertainty about all that unsettled weather, particularly that low that comes through on Saturday. But then confidence actually rockets up. And it's as high as it can be for next Monday. Really high confidence in the idea of that high pressure coming in and bringing some settled weather for a time. Something colder, perhaps even frosty at times too. In fact, you would expect some frost at this time of year with some settled weather and the air coming through from the north or northeast. You would expect some pretty chilly nights. But very high confidence, exceptionally high. To be honest, I've never seen confidence for 6 or 7 days ahead to be that high. Then it drops down much closer to average, the forecast confidence, which is business as usual to some extent, in as much as that high may cling on for a little while as we go through much of next week, or it could just be a 1 or 2 day kind of feature and then push through, and then we get some more changeable weather as we go towards the end of next week. So that's still all to play for at the moment, but I just wanted to highlight how exceptionally high the confidence is for next week, the beginning part of next week in particular. So just to clarify, there is some unsettled weather to come as we go through this week, particularly Wednesday into Thursday, and then on the weekend as well. The exact track that low at the weekend is going to take and exactly when it's going to deepen, how much it's going to deepen, that's still all to play for. Right, I think that's everything that I wanted to cover for the immediate forecast. Like I said, I will be talking about the winter forecast in a second, but first I wanted to have a little look back at what happened in or during November and autumn, because it is now meteorological winter. We have started looking at the winter months now, and instead we have our statistics from November and the autumn that has been. Interestingly, when you look at the month, the seasons across the UK, the statistics look fairly average, and they don't really tell the story until you look at the detail. Behind me I have the map of rainfall compared to average for November across the UK, and you can see many parts of the country had much drier than average, the browns showing that it's much drier than average through November. And in the southern half of the UK, it only looks around average or a little bit wetter than average in some places. But like I said, that doesn't really tell the story. So if we actually look at the rainfall across the UK as we went through the month as a whole, and you can really see it was a tale of two halves. The first 2 weeks of November, we were stuck under that high pressure anticyclonic gloom. It was pretty cloudy, but there wasn't a huge amount of rain. As a result, it was pretty dry. It was one of the driest first 2 weeks of November on record. But then we had some much wetter weather towards the second half of the month, particularly when Storm Bert came through in that weekend around the 22nd, 23rd of November. Some very wet weather then. We had around 6 inches in some places, so exceptionally wet event. And you can see that here. And so when you average it all together, it wasn't especially notable, but there were some, when you split it up, a very, very dry start to the month and then some very wet weather later on. Then the other thing that I wanted to talk about when it comes to November is the fluctuation in temperatures, as well as the largely dry, cloudy weather. That anticyclonic gloom that we had to start November also led to things being pretty mild. And so temperatures were ever so slightly above average to begin with. Then, just before Bert, you may remember, we had that cold Arctic air coming down from the north. We had a fairly significant snow event across many parts of the UK. Even in the south, we had some major snow. Here in Exeter, we had some significant snow. And with that, we saw much colder than average temperatures for a few days. And then thereafter, it's kind of been up and down through the last week of November. But again, a tale of two halves when you look at the temperatures. So if you looked at the month as a whole, it really wouldn't paint the right story and wouldn't tell the details that you can if you look at things a bit differently. So I've talked about November, but now let's look at autumn. And again, when you look at autumn as a whole, it misses bits out, because we did get off to quite a wet start. September was pretty wet, particularly across parts of England. 10 counties had their wettest September on record, and I think even Oxfordshire and Bedfordshire had their wettest calendar month on record. So a wet start to autumn. Then October wasn't as wet, and then we had that drier period to begin with November, but then you can still see just how noteworthy Storm Bert was coming through with how high this bar chart is for those last couple of weeks of November, that it really was quite wet compared to the rest of the period, even though earlier on in the season it had been pretty wet. Also, you can see that again, here is our cumulative rainfall compared to average. And you can see for the first, it was quite wet beginning of September. This is across the whole of the UK, and it was fluctuating around. It was a bit wetter than average as we go through towards October. So by the time that we were getting towards the end of October, autumn so far had been wetter than average. And then November happened, and we had that very dry period, those 2 weeks of very dry weather, and that took us well below the average for that stage in autumn. And then even with the increase in rainfall towards the end of the month with the storm coming through, it didn't get, when you look at the UK as a whole, it didn't get above average. So autumn for the UK was drier than average by a fair chunk, even though we had a couple of months where it was wetter than average and then a very wet period. Because of this 2 weeks where it was so dry during November, it really has skewed the average when we look at it now. The other thing when we look at November, again, here's our map showing the rainfall amounts and the anomaly compared to average. And again, there's quite a north-south split, but it's even more marked compared to November when we look at the season as a whole. So drier than average across much of Scotland, Northern Ireland, and some parts of Wales and East Anglia, but across central southern parts of England, here it was markedly wetter than average. Gloucestershire had its wettest autumn on record, with around 74% more rain than average. And so it really was very wet, and you can see why we had some impact. So again, when you look at the UK as a whole through the whole month, it doesn't really stand out. But when you look at the detail, there were some very noteworthy weather events. Now, here at the Met Office, every month we issue a 3-month outlook, which gives us a trend of the type of weather we can expect through the following 3 months. But this one is perhaps the most important one each year because it covers us through the whole of meteorological winter. Now, to talk about why we issue these and what this one actually shows, I'm joined by Deputy Chief Meteorologist Chris Bulmer. Thank you for joining me, Chris. And now, a couple of things about the 3-month outlook. First of all, why do we issue these? They're not, they don't go into the detail, do they?
No, certainly not. These are not going to give us an idea about kind of weather conditions on any day or on any given week through the forecast period. The one we're looking at kind of covers December, January and February, but what we can use it for by looking at the 3 months as a whole is we kind of look for anomalies in the forecast. So whether there's any signals that the weather through that 3-month period might be wetter than normal or drier than normal or warmer than normal. So it's really, we're looking at those anomalies through that full 3-month period rather than any kind of specific weather patterns at any given time.
And why do we issue these? Who uses them?
Well, the products and the kind of service was originally designed for contingency planners, so people that have to make decisions kind of at longer lead times. So for most people, this kind of forecast really is just for awareness only. But there are some people, you know, for example, in the energy industry that have to try and manage things like energy demand. So obviously, there's still a lot of science and development to come in these forecasts. There's still, to a degree, a limited level of skill, but the information is still useful for people trying to do that kind of longer-term planning of resources or whatever is requirements for their business.
So initially, I suppose it wasn't for most people to look at. In fact, we kind of hid it away on the website for a little while, didn't we?
It wasn't developed as a public-facing service, but I think we learned that there is actually some merit in releasing this information to the public because, yeah, you might not be able to make absolute decisions based on it, but it might just increase your awareness and allow you to think about what kind of weather might be more likely in the coming season.
I think it's important people understand what it is and what it isn't telling us. Let's take this one, for example. So yes, this covers the whole of December, January and February, meteorological winter. And what kind of things is this one indicating to us?
So yeah, so we split the forecast into 3 headlines. So we have a look at temperature, have a look at rainfall, and have a look at how windy the season will be. And we split the forecast up into 3 categories. So the middle category is kind of 60% of the forecast, which is the kind of near average conditions. But then at the either end of the forecast, so for example in temperature, we've got mild and cold. So that's the kind of, normally in the forecast distribution, that likelihood of those would be 20%. If you've got a forecast that's kind of giving you no signal from what has been normal for the last 30-year climatology, which we use to put this together. So what we do is we look at our forecast and see how that compares to that 30-year climatology. So we look at our forecast models and the science behind them. and we're trying to see where those anomalies might be. So if we look at the headline probabilities we've got here, so we start on the top one, so for temperatures. So just a reminder, so if this was a kind of, the forecast was showing us perfectly normal average conditions for the winter, that still means you'll get variation in weather patterns, but the kind of through the full 3 months it will be close to that 30-year climatology. That would suggest there's a 20% chance of cold and a 20% chance of mild. We can see on this forecast that we're skewed towards mild, so rather than 20%
quite significantly,
quite significantly, yeah. So that's up at 45%, and only 5% cold. Now, one thing, because we're comparing this to a 30-year climatology, and of course we're well aware of climate change, the UK climate is warming. So that means because if we were just to look at the last few winters and compare them to the last 30 years, we would see that on average they would be warmer than the last 30 years. So it's normal now that with that climate change signal that we normally tend to be skewed towards mild or warmer for the season. But actually for 45% that's telling us a little bit more information than that, because based on, as we'll see shortly, the prevailing weather patterns, which are expected to come more from the west, that does indicate that we're more likely to have above average temperatures as a whole for the season. Doesn't mean we won't get some cold outbreaks. There's always that caveat that, in a typical winter conditions, you always get some colder spells. But indicated by just a 5% chance of cold, that tells us that there's only a very small chance that the winter as a whole will be kind of cold compared to that 30-year climatology. So in terms of temperature, there's very much a skew towards mild for the winter.
And it's skewed towards mild, taking both climate change into account and other things. So this isn't just climate change.
That's not just climate change. That's also to do with the prevailing weather regimes that the models and the science is telling us is most likely for the coming winter.
We'll talk about that in a second.
We will. But you can see how that comes out as well in the rainfall and the wind. So again, we would normally expect, or kind of a forecast with no signal compared to the climatology would suggest 20, 60, 20. But we can see both, to a less degree in temperature, but both rainfall and winds are both skewed towards wet and windy. So it doesn't give us a definitive answer that yes, the winter will be wetter than windy than normal, but that chance is higher than it would be as going into a normal winter.
It's more likely to be wetter and windier than average than drier and
exactly. Of course, in any given winter you see wet and windy spells, but this is suggesting they may be more frequent, or there's a greater chance that they'll be more frequent than what is typical in any given winter.
And the skew that climate changes are having on the temperature, that's less impactful on...
I don't think we're seeing that in the headlines here. I think this is more to do with the prevailing weather patterns, which the models are kind of suggesting rather than the climate change signal here.
Let's get on to those though. So the prevailing weather patterns, what kind of thing are we talking about?
So this is one of the things we look at when we're putting the forecast together. So this is kind of like a weather model which we look at for the week ahead, but this is run out for much longer lead times, and it's an ensemble model, so run many times. And this is looking at mean sea level pressure for the whole 3 months. And again, it's coming up with an anomaly compared to what the average is for the full 3 months. So all those model simulations compared to average, and we've got anomalies on this chart. So what we can see on this chart...
So this is the 3-month anomaly pressure pattern for December, January, February.
December, January, February. And probably worth saying as well, and this is from the Met Office seasonal forecast system, which is called Glossy. Right. When we're putting the forecast together, we put a lot of weight in our forecast system, but we look at, there's other seasonal forecast systems that from around the world which we look at. So we look at them all and see, is there common signals? Are they saying the same thing? Are they differing? And we try and understand what's driving these signals as well, which we'll come on to. But what we can see is actually relatively consistent for this winter amongst those different the different centres, is they've got this similar pattern. So people will be familiar that we normally see in the UK winds from the west. So you have a pressure gradient where you get lower pressure to the north of the Atlantic and higher pressure to the south. Now this isn't necessarily telling us that, this is talking about anomalies. And where it's blue, what it's telling us is over that 3-month period as a whole, the model is suggesting that in these areas pressure will be lower than average, and in these areas pressure will be higher than average. And that's one thing where there is skill in seasonal prediction systems in terms of forecasting the kind of general, what we call kind of circulation patterns. One term that some people may have heard of is the North Atlantic Oscillation. So put simply, that's a pressure dipole between Iceland and the Azores. And so when pressure is lower than average near Iceland and higher than average near the Azores, that tends to be called a positive North Atlantic Oscillation. And with that, in terms of weather conditions for the UK, that tends to be associated with, in winter, warmer than average, wetter than average and windy than average conditions. So it's suggesting a kind of enhancement of westerly winds through the season as a whole.
So a mobile pattern with weather systems coming in from the Atlantic.
And it doesn't mean we'll see that pattern persist for the full 3 months. And you can kind of almost see there's some indication of higher than average pressure trying to extend from the southwest to some degree in these charts. And some of that, if we break it down month by month, there's a bit more sign of higher than average pressure in December, and then this pattern gets squashed a little bit further south in January, February. So there will be some seasonal differences, and the weather pattern won't be stuck in one pattern for the full 3 month period. But based on the modelling for the full 3 months as a whole, we get these kind of anomalies which point towards those headline figures which we looked at previously.
You mentioned higher than average pressure, perhaps more likely during the beginning part of winter, which is what we could see next week.
Yeah, so exactly, we've seen really big fluctuations with our weather at late. So in November we saw some very mild spells and cold spells, and it also looks like we're kind of heading into that kind of pattern at the moment. We'll see some mild unsettled weather at the start of this week, and then into next week it looks more like we're going to see more of a northerly and more high pressure trying to build from the west. So there are signs of this kind of what is showing in these models already in December.
So obviously this was model data that we've used, and you mentioned that we used lots of different model outputs, but what other things do you look at other than just model data?
Yeah, well, so we work kind of collaboratively to put these forecasts together. So we look at the models, so what I've kind of talked about there from Met Office Seasonal System Glossy, but we also look at these things called teleconnections. So looking at these kind of things that have a remote influence on the weather patterns that we have in the UK and kind of more generally in Northwest Europe. So when you talk about teleconnections, probably the thing that most people will be aware of is the El Nino Southern Oscillation. So it really gets a lot of attention in the press. For example, last winter, and last winter we had an El Nino event, so that had a lot of traction. And an El Nino event, so we're looking at sea surface temperature patterns here. Well, these again are anomalies of sea surface temperatures in the Pacific. During an El Nino period that we saw last winter, all this area of the central and eastern Pacific, the sea temperatures were warmer than average at low latitudes. We can see in terms of ENSO, which we kind of call in short, we've got a reverse pattern this winter. So the pattern of sea surface temperatures over the Pacific at the moment, so this graphic is just showing us observed information from the last couple of weeks, and it's showing some quite weak anomalies but colder than average over the central and eastern Pacific.
So this is sea surface temperature anomalies. The blue is obviously showing that it's colder than average for this time of year. Here's Australia, and so in the Pacific, right? And so it's the opposite of an El Nino. It's
the opposite, and we're looking most importantly at the equator. So what we're looking at here is the sea surface temperatures being colder than average in these areas and weakly warmer than average, what we call kind of the maritime continent, but more commonly this is Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, that kind of area. So where it's red, that's showing it's warmer than average. Now in the tropics, one of the main drivers of where we get kind of more persistent heavy showers and thunderstorms is these sea surface temperatures. So we know that sea surface temperatures drive weather patterns within the tropics. So we know, based on how this pattern sets up, it'll have some influence of where the kind of most persistent heavy showers and thunderstorms will be over the coming season. Now, we've kind of talked about El Nino Southern Oscillation. So this is a pattern close to what would be termed La Nina, but this pattern is quite weak actually at the moment.
And no one's declared it La Nina just yet.
No, so it's not officially La Nina, and you need two things really for a La Nina. We're looking at the ocean here, so you need a certain strength anomaly in the ocean, but you also need coupling with the atmosphere, and we've not really seen that based on some of the other metrics we look at. So when we look at the Pacific, we can say, from a teleconnections point of view, we may be getting some influence, which is typical of a La Nina winter, but it's not a strong La Nina, and it may still try and establish itself. So it still is a valid teleconnection for us to look at, but it doesn't mean it. But it's not necessarily kind of a big driver of mid-latitude weather patterns for the coming winter.
But it's still fascinating that we're looking, to literally the other side of the world, and what's going on there at the moment plays quite a key role in what the weather's going to do over the whole winter for the UK.
Absolutely, and this kind of pattern is being well researched. There's an awful lot of research has been done trying to link different phases of ENSO, so El Nino and La Nina, and then try to work out how that influences patterns that affect the UK, particularly in winter. And research has shown that it does have some quite distinct influences on the broad weather patterns. So with a La Nina, so again, we're not quite there yet, but we've got a pattern not dissimilar to that, and that tends to favour kind of a higher chance of kind of drier and colder weather in early winter. But once we get into late winter, so more January and February, it kind of favours warmer, wetter and windier weather. And that's something which is actually consistent. So the research is actually quite consistent with what the operational modelling which we've got at the moment is showing us, which gives us some confidence in the forecast, but still comes with the caveat that there's a lot of uncertainty in these seasonal forecasts.
So yeah, that was really useful. I think lots of people would take a lot of that on board. But just to recap then, so this is our 3-month outlook for winter. And yes, milder, wetter and windier than average, more likely than colder, drier and calmer. No guarantee, and even within that there will be fluctuations. There'll be some calmer days, there'll be some wetter, windier days, there'll be some colder spells. So winter as normal, but just at the end of, so in 3 months' time I'll get you back on and we can see how well we did. Yeah,
absolutely. And obviously this is a probabilistic forecast, so this is not saying it will be wetter and windier than average, but we're saying compared to normal there's a greater chance of that. So we kind of have to verify these over a longer period than one winter, but we do look back at these forecasts every time we issue them to see what we can learn and see how they verify.
That's great. Thank you so much for joining me, Chris. I'll see you again in 3 months' time.
Thank you.
Over the weekend, some of you may have thought you saw a UFO in the sky, but of course it wasn't. Now, I saw this photo on Twitter, or X as it now is, from @LouMartin15. Thank you very much, Lou, for saying I could talk about it in this deep dive. And her partner took this photo somewhere in South Yorkshire on Friday, and it shows this rather stunning cloud, which I guess some may think looks like a UFO. It really does, and in the past this type of cloud had been confused with UFOs. It's actually called lenticularis, or autocumulus lenticularis, and it's formed on days where the air is quite stable, and as the wind hits against any high ground, any hills or mountains, it then bounces over it, and then downwind of the hills and mountains we then get this rippling effect where the air goes up and down, it leads to mountain waves, and in some days it leads to these stunning clouds forming. You can kind of see the air travelling over and then coming down the other side in that rippling pattern when you look at the cloud. They're one of my favourite clouds because they do look so picturesque. So thank you again for Lou for letting me talk about that today. Then the last thing that I wanted to talk to you about today before I go is something that came up in the comments from last week's deep dive. Well done to Honor. It was her first deep dive and it was really good. If you haven't had a chance to watch it, then do check it out. But one of the comments asked about sunrise and sunset times as we get closer to the winter solstice, because there is something I think may surprise a fair few of you. Now, behind me I have the sunrise sunset times for Leeds. I've picked Leeds as just somewhere relatively central in the UK. Now, most of us know that around at the winter solstice, which this year is the 21st, we have our shortest days. That's when we have the least amount of, or the least day length. So the shortest period between sunrise and sunset. And you can see on the 21st for Leeds, there's around 7 hours, 24 minutes and 42 seconds between sunrise and sunset. But you may think that sunrise will get later and later up until the solstice, and sunset will get earlier and earlier up until the solstice at an even amount. But actually that's not the case. If we look at sunrise times to start off with, and yes, they are getting later and later and later and later until the solstice, but they actually continue to get later and later for a little while yet. In fact, it takes until beyond the end of the year, until the 1st of January, for sunrise times to start to get lighter. So even though we've, after the 21st, crossed the winter solstice and had the shortest day, our mornings will continue to get darker for a little while yet, for over a week longer, and it's not until the 1st of January when the mornings will start to get lighter. The flip side of this is our evenings will start to get lighter a bit earlier than you might expect. If we look at our sunset times, and yes, they're getting earlier and earlier up until around the 15th, 16th, and it's here a few days before the winter solstice that sunset times start to get later, and so that's when we'll start to get lighter evenings. So we get lighter evenings before we get lighter mornings. Now, the reason for this is because, well, it's a couple of things. It's because the solar day is a little bit longer than 24 hours. The solar day being the length of time that it takes for the Earth to rotate such that it goes from the noon to noon position, so where the sun is relative in the sky. The reason why the solar day is a bit longer, that's for two reasons. One, the Earth is tilted on its axis a little bit at around 23.4 degrees, and the orbit that the Earth takes around the sun isn't quite circular, it's elliptical. And so as a result, there are times in the year when the Earth is a little bit closer and a little bit further away from the sun. Now, as we head into January, we're getting closer to the time when the sun is at its closest, the Earth is at its closest point to the sun. As a result, because it's getting closer and closer, the orbit, its speed actually speeds up a little bit. Because of this and the tilt in the Earth's axis, the time that it takes for the Earth to spin such that its solar day actually is a bit longer. So it has to rotate more for the sun to go from the noon to noon position. So because of this, we end up with this slight variation, slight discrepancy perhaps in what you would expect between the sunrise and sunset times. So that could be something that you impress your friends later on with some knowledge. The fact that even though the solstice is on the 21st, our evenings will start to get lighter before that, a few days before, and our mornings won't start to get lighter than that until the beginning of the new year. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope that made some sense. I made sure that I tried to cover it because I found it quite interesting. There is a lot of weather going on at the moment, so remember we do have some more unsettled weather to come as we go through the rest of this week and possibly this coming weekend. As always, if you've enjoyed anything that I've talked about today, do hit the like button, do hit the subscribe button if you're not already one of our many subscribers. Make sure you share this with anyone who might find anything interesting. And also, if you have any questions or comments, please do leave them in the comments section and I'll try to respond to some of them later on. I've enjoyed doing this deep dive. I think it's Honor doing the 10-day trend tomorrow. It will be her first 10-day trend, and that will definitely be one to check out as we'll have a better idea of what's going to be happening this weekend. I'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.